All right. If anyone was really paying attention just then, well, anyway, here are the questions. So essentially, what you've got to do is multifold. And you've got to basically do the secondary dominance for major keys, for minor keys. The questions are a little bit harder from the standpoint that the key signatures have ramped up a little bit. You have more chord writing in closed position. You have some scales. It's a little bit more stuff, I know. You have a solfege and chordal analysis. You have a non-harmonic tone analysis. And I've actually, so what I've done is, I've actually, you know what, let me just open this in. Just open this over here. So what I've done is I've actually given you the possible answers. I basically said there's two passing tones. There's one appoggiatura. There's one escape tone. There's one. So it's kind of like matching, basically. So that should kind of get you started and contain your work flow in such a way that you can get the answer correctly more quickly. I have a question about binary and ternary form. There are some fill-in-the-blank questions. These answers you can find on OneNote, but we'll talk a little bit more about these today. There are some melodic transformation questions. Again, like I gave you the possible answers. They're matching, basically. So you just have to kind of check that you have the correct number of incidences. So there's a best answer sort of situation, and so just use that to your advantage, okay? And then there's the dictation. So yes, this assignment will take you a little bit longer, but just get a start on it now. Just do a little bit every day, and you should be totally fine. And ask questions. I'm happy to answer them. And well, without giving you the exact answer, hopefully. But yeah, we'll talk about a lot of this. We'll talk about this stuff today because there's a lot of stuff to kind of review. Am I recording right now? Okay, cool. All right. So I guess one of the things I wanted to talk about that we didn't talk as much about is form. Well, we did talk about it, but just kind of to review it. So I guess the main distinction between binary and ternary form is that binary has two sections, has an A section and a B section, and ternary form has three sections. It's an A section, a B section, and an A section. Okay. So there are buzzwords associated with these forms. I put them in red on these slides. And but I guess to kind of begin with a broader understanding of what these forms are. In simple binary form, you have two sections, and once the first section is more or less independent from the second section. Okay? So what that basically means is you have, I guess you have the first section of the piece as defined by a period. Okay? So a period, if you recall, basically has two phrases. And the first phrase is less conclusive harmonically, and the second phrase is more conclusive harmonically. So with that kind of template, you have a very compelling sort of statement. You have two ideas, essentially, that gel together into one larger idea. And I guess that's the bare minimum in order to kind of determine a larger section like this. So an A section of a piece. Let's say you're writing a piece. You could write a phrase that has not so much of a conclusive answer, and then you could respond to that phrase, and that response can be more conclusive, and that can be like the template for the A section of your song or piece. So, you know, I guess I can play this. Let me see. Got this weird tech setup here, so let me see if things... Oh, my pedal's not working. Think about why that's the A section. There we go. I had the wrong pedal connected. Isn't that sustain? Sustain is nice. Okay. A section again. That's the first section. Now here's an interesting idea. In this particular period, you have two phrases. The first phrase is somewhat conclusive, actually. There's a 5 going to a 1. Okay? In the key of D minor. The second phrase actually has a 5 going to 1 in a new key. Okay? So I guess we haven't talked about modulation yet, but I guess this particular piece of music actually modulates to the relative major. And the result of this is, this isn't necessarily an example where this cadence is like stronger than this cadence, because they're both authentic cadences. But in this example, you can this takes this phrase and develops it further. You can see how these two things are united. It's a continuation. Whether or not you see an aspect of this being harmonically stronger is kind of irrelevant. You kind of see this phrase as being continuation of this phrase. And so a period, in a more loose definition, is just two phrases that are related to each other and can kind of, as a result, form a larger period as a result. And in this case, a period is all that's really necessary for differentiating an A section from a B section. So the A section basically consists of this period. It's period 1. And what really kind of solidifies the fact that this is a unified section is the fact that there's a repeat sign. So it's intentional for you to actually take these two phrases and play them together sequentially. So that's another kind of giveaway that this is these two sections are indeed related to each other. Because you're supposed to play them together twice. Okay? So this is period 1. So then period 2 has two phrases that are not quite similar to the first phrases. They're different from a contour standpoint. Like the melody, the contour of this melody is quite different from the contour of this melody. The bass line of this melody is kind of different from the bass line of this melody, right? It's quite different. So it seems like a totally different idea. Right? And you repeat this part twice, okay? Now, kind of considering why this is a phrase versus this is a phrase. Let's listen to this one, this system in isolation. So what you basically see, it starts in F major. And then here we have an A major chord. So an A major chord, interestingly, you can actually describe that as a secondary dominant in F major, right? We haven't talked about modulation yet. But I guess to kind of preview modulation, you know how we were talking about secondary dominants and how they can kind of foreshadow, they can kind of tonicize a different key area? Well, sometimes that tonicization can be so strong that you actually go to that key area and you never return back to the original key area, right? So in this particular case, if you recall, A major in the key of F, if I'm thinking about this correct, let's see. Right. A major doesn't exist as there's no like 6 major chord in the major scale. So you can kind of think of that 6 chord as being a secondary dominant, provided the following chord is actually a 5th below it. Well, what's a 5th below the root of A major?
D.
D, right? So it just happens to be that the following chord is actually, after it kind of hangs out in this A dominant 7th land for some time. It hangs out here, and finally it actually goes back to D minor. So it's actually, in this particular case, it's actually modulating to back to D minor. But you can kind of see how this is not necessarily the strongest cadence as a result, because you're neither in F major or in D minor at this particular moment in time, right? It's sort of like it's a half cadence, I guess, in D minor, and it's a secondary dominant in F major, right? If you consider this chord in the lens of F major, it's this is a foreshadowing for modulation. But if you consider this A major chord in F major, it's actually a 5 of let's see. I think it's a 5 of 3, because earlier I have to actually go back for a second. The A major is actually the 3rd chord degree in F major, and so I erroneously pointed to the 6th chord degree. What I meant to point to was the 3rd chord degree. So like if the first chord degree is F, if the tonic of the first chord, if the root of the first chord is F, and the root of the 2 chord is G, and the root of the 3 chord is A, you're expecting the quality of the 3 chord to be A minor. But what you have instead in this piece is A major. So it just goes to show that the 3 major chord doesn't exist as a natural primary triad of the F major key. However, it can exist as a secondary dominant. So let's just look at this really quickly and let's see. So what we have is basically we have an A major triad, which is out of the way. A major triad is 3 chord, which is not in the key of F major. Gosh, moving stuff around. But the 3 chord can be expressed as a 5 of, well, what is a fifth below A? And you already said D, right? You said D minor? You said D. So D, in the context of the key of F major, is which scale degree?
The 6.
6, okay? And just to make sure that we're doing this correctly, we have to make sure that this denominator chord actually exists in the key that we're in, okay? So the 6, this minor 6, I should make a chart for this in all keys, so I can just quickly show you what this looks like in F major. But it does turn out that the 6 chord is minor in major keys. So the result is this A major chord can be represented as a 5 of 6 in the key of F major. Gee, sorry, it keeps moving stuff around. It can also be, oh gosh, it's moving all my stuff around. It can also be expressed as the 5 in the key of D minor. Okay, we're kind of foreshadowing modulation here, but I just wanted to kind of give you an idea for what this chord is in both key areas. So this A major chord can be expressed as the 5 of 6 in the key of F major, or it can be expressed as the 5 chord in the key of D minor. So this is one important aspect of modulation, is that chords can be expressed in 2 different key areas, and this is an important feature of modulation and how you get from one key to another key, sometimes by using a common chord to both keys. So anyway, that was all to say, that was a little bit of a tangent, but that's all to say that this first phrase in the second period is not as strong, right? It's a secondary dominant in the key of F major, and it's a half cadence in the key of D minor, right? So let's listen to the second phrase. Right? So what we have here is a D minor, strong D minor, 5-1 authentic cadence, okay? Great. So simple binary form, once again, is that there are 2 distinct sections. That's the real big thing. There are 2 distinct sections. Should emphasize that. And there's independence between both sections, okay? Contrast that with rounded binary form. And there's actually a lot of overlap in material. So this is O Susanna. And what I'm getting at here is these orange boxes actually show the overlap in material from the first section to the second section. So what you see essentially over here is in the first period, right, and then it goes to a different key. So notice how a large portion, now this is important, a large portion of it actually reappears near the end of the piece, right? A large portion of the A section reappears. So this is rounded binary. They're not totally, these 2 sections are not totally independent from each other. Another important feature of rounded binary is that I guess it has to do with the key area to some degree. Usually, in rounded binary, let's see. Okay. So in rounded binary, you don't have to have an exact restatement of the melodic material. So for instance, like in the Mozart example, let's actually listen to that. I'm going to take you to this website, which has a bunch of examples that you can listen to. Okay. So this is the rounded binary example. Can you hear that? Okay. Okay, cool. Let me go back. Go back to the beginning. Oh, jeez. There we go. Cool. Yes. So I guess the big takeaway here is that what you see here, evidently, in phrase 4, is the opening melodic material, right? And it doesn't necessarily restate anything verbatim from the original section, right? And I'll show you what I mean. So for instance, in the opening section, there's actually a half cadence here. I guess I can show you this over here. There's a half cadence over here. So we're in the key of D major. And this right here, if I were to circle the notes in question that kind of inform my idea of the half cadence. This right here would make this a half cadence. So we have a A major chord. Cadence. Right? So what you see over in the second section is what you see is we're in the key of D major. But near the end, we actually cadence in D major. Okay? So, drawing tool. Right. Cadence. Well, I guess one chord. Authentic. Cadence, and then I guess right here is a 5 chord. Right? And I guess you can call this a rearticulated suspension. And so what I'm getting at is that this material, even though it's a restatement of material in the first section, it's not exactly a restatement. It's a little different. But at the same token, you can actually see it referencing it to some great length, right? It's actually like half of the actual form is making some reference to the original idea from the first section of the piece, right? So that's what rounded binary form is. Okay? Now, this is not to be confused with balanced binary form, which has more of a specific kind of definition. So in balanced binary form, the first section ends in a new key. So I guess by definition, balanced binary is always continuous binary form. We're going to get to sectional versus continuous, but the idea behind sectional versus continuous is that the first section of the piece in sectional binary ends in the tonic chord, ends in the one chord. In continuous binary, the first section, the A section, ends on a chord that isn't the tonic, which makes it continuous. Okay? So I guess the reason I bring this up is, by definition, balanced binary form, since the first section ends in a new key, it has to be, by definition, continuous binary form. Okay? There's another peculiar feature of balanced binary form. There's this idea of literal transposition. Okay? This is always bad, because whenever I change something, all my boxes shift. So I guess transposed. Okay? So this is an important feature of balanced binary versus rounded binary. In rounded binary, you don't have this literal transposition necessarily. You have a reference to the original material, but you're not literally transposing it. Whereas in balanced binary, what you have, I guess these are the two sections that are pertinent in terms of the repetition, is what you have is basically a literal transposition of this final cadence. And the idea is the cadence in the first section, since it's not in the original key, makes continuous binary form. And so that leads you to want to resolve this exact cadence in the original key at the end of the second section. So I guess an important part of balanced versus rounded is there's a couple of things. For one, the length of motivic relation, the length of the related sections between the A, the length of the related portions between the A and the B sections of the piece are shorter relative to like how large the section is. So you can see like only like 2 measures of this like entire piece were actually referenced in the second section, right? Whereas in rounded binary, you see like literally like 1/2 of the A section is referenced. Okay? So that's one component of it. That's a difference between balanced and rounded binary form. Another difference is that I guess there is this literal transposition. So this material right here is literally transposed to the original key area. Okay? And I guess those are the 2 big differences between balanced binary and rounded binary form. Okay? Ternary form is pretty easy. It's just ABA form. There's 3 sections. There's a beginning section, there's a middle section, and then there's a return to the beginning material. Okay, yeah. Midterm is take home. Someone just came in late and they're like freaking out. I'm like, nope, it's take home. Cool. So this is ternary form. There's an A section, a B section, and an A section. We've talked about sectional versus continuous binary form. In that, in continuous binary form, the first A section ends in a key area that isn't the tonic. Whereas in sectional binary form, the A section ends on a chord that is the tonic. Okay? So like for instance right here, we're in G minor. this is where the section ends. And we actually end in tonic, in the tonic key. This sort of sectionalizes the A section from the B section in terms of key area, because most often you're going to start the B section in a different key. So they have sectionalization according to key area, essentially. Whereas in continuous binary form, you kind of allude oftentimes by being in a different key area at the end of the A section, you kind of allude to the new key area of the B section before the B section even happens. So for instance, I guess our previous example is a good example of that. So you end in the 5 chord, right? Right? So we're in A major right here. And then you kind of stay in A major for a little bit. Not very long. But you start in A, right? So it's sort of foreshadowing this A major kind of tonality before it happens. So it's continuous in that regard. Okay? Okay, I think that's enough information to help you kind of solve the binary versus ternary kind of form section on the midterm. But of course, if you have any questions, let me know. So in sectional binary, will the first section end probably in plagal or authentic cadence? Yes. By definition, yes. Because in sectional binary, you actually have to end in the same key area that you started in. So by definition, you have to, well, most likely you'll have some sort of harmonic cadence, like authentic or plagal. Yes. Cool. So great. So this is the big of it. And oh, let's see. There's something else in the chat. Can sectional and continuous be applied to ternary as well as other forms? I haven't seen it applied to those forms, but I feel as though it wouldn't be a stretch to do that. I'm trying to think of what it would mean to have sectional ternary form, and I guess all it would be is that you don't foreshadow the key area of the B section. Whereas in continuous ternary form, you could kind of foreshadow the key area of the middle section. So I can see that actually. You know, Chopin was one of the greatest creators of middle sections in music, in my opinion. And oftentimes he would just arrive at a new key area, and you're like, where did this key area come from? In that case, I think that's a good example of sectional. You know, you're like, okay, we're in a brand new key. We have kind of a direct modulation. We haven't talked about modulation yet, but in other words, we basically go to this key area instantaneously. But yeah, phrase modulation. Phrase modulation. Can you explain what that is? I'm actually...
Never mind. I thought that was like a term for direct.
I'm sorry, you're cutting in and out.
I thought that was another term for when you directly modulate, when you begin a new section.
Sorry, half of what you're saying, like you said, I think that was another term for what?
For when you begin another section instantly in a new key.
Oh, okay. That's a term for when you begin another section in a new key. I'll have to look into that. That term sounds so familiar to me. I bet you're correct. Well, we're probably going to touch upon it in modulation, so yeah. Let's see. Okay, so we've talked about kind of the bigger aspects of it. There's no mention of the blues form yet on the midterm, but let's kind of review sort of the small of it a little bit. The homework problems I've given you are a little more straightforward in terms of kind of matching the definitions, the characteristic definitions for some of these phenomena. So for instance, appoggiatura, I made a point to have it be a characteristic appoggiatura. That is, you're approached by leap, and you're resolved by step in the opposite direction, and the appoggiatura note occurs on a downbeat, and it's not a chord tone. Okay, that's the most characteristic appoggiatura. There's a grace note appoggiatura that's also kind of common, but this is the characteristic definition that I want you to be aware of when you're doing this midterm. Approached by leap, resolved by step in the opposite direction. It occurs on a downbeat, and the appoggiatura tone is not a chord tone. Okay, so appoggiatura, great stuff, right? Escape tone. Escape tone. It's a harmonic tone, a non-harmonic tone that steps away from the chord tone, then returns by skip in the opposite direction from the two main notes. Okay, so I think there's an escape tone in there as well. Escape tone. Cool. How's the audio coming through? I'm not wearing headphones today, but is there any doubling or weird artifacts as a result of that? Okay, that's good. I'm guessing it's coming through my microphone and through my interface, but I guess if it's not a problem, it's okay. Okay. I don't think I had a neighbor group, but I guess it's worth talking about. There's many different names for these, depending on which theoretician you ask. But basically, you have an upper neighbor to one of the tones and a lower neighbor to one of the tones. And I guess it's an upper, it can be, it's usually in relation to both tones, because you kind of arrive back at the original tone. So this is, since these two tones are the same, this E and this E right here, this F is an upper neighbor to this E, and this D is a lower neighbor to this E. Right? It's an interesting way to accomplish two dissonant notes at the same time. It was a thing that was discovered prior to the 16th century. Medieval musicians were very excited to be able to incorporate two dissonant such tones without having a negative consequence on the piece of music in the line. So they were very conservative back in the days. So I think this is where a lot of these terms may have come from, actually. In fact, I know that's generally to be the case because counterpoint textbooks are where you can find a lot of these definitions as well. And counterpoint is basically the ancient study of how you can take two melodic lines and kind of integrate them together. It's a very fascinating subject. Okay, neighbor tone. This isn't here. The ant, I don't think it's on your midterm, but I guess it's kind of worth knowing. So depending on who you ask, this might fall into the vague jurisdiction of appoggiatura land, because sometimes, I guess, accented passing tones, I guess I'll talk about the accented passing tone first, is this idea that you basically have a passing motion, and the middle note actually results on a strong beat. The note that is actually part of the passing motion occurs on a strong beat instead of a weak beat. So here, the passing motion occurs on a weak beat. Here, the passing motion occurs on a strong beat. And some theoreticians refer to this as an appoggiatura. There's like so many weird definitions of appoggiaturas. I think this area of music theory is not the most well-defined. But I guess the result to keep in mind for an accented passing tone is that you have a dissonance on a strong beat. So in that sense, it kind of satisfies a few of the characteristics of a characteristic appoggiatura, right? Because a dissonance on a downbeat is one of the main parts of a characteristic appoggiatura. So, okay. Similarly, I guess you can call this accented neighboring tone. you can call this an accented neighboring tone. I think that's the more precise way to talk about it. I would avoid using appoggiatura as a blanket statement for everything. And, you know, I was just finding myself in a situation yesterday where I was having to talk the talk with some people about music theory, and people were kind of being a little fast and loose with some of these terminology. But one person in particular was being really precise with the terminology they were using, and I guess conversationally it made it easier to understand what they were talking about. It was like basically we were analyzing a Schumann piece, and someone was commenting on the dissonances on the downbeats, and we were like, I think someone, by calling it an appoggiatura or by calling it an accented passing tone or something that's more precise than just saying it's a dissonance or something, it made it a little easier to follow the conversation, because it was quite a dense paragraph of musical description. So anyway, you can use this to describe your own music if you're ever interested in analyzing your own music, to figure out if you have any tendencies or if you want to change your music somehow based on some of these techniques that are available to you. You can kind of analyze the melodies, or basically, yeah, the melodic notes in context of whether they're harmonic or non-harmonic. So these techniques are useful compositionally. Like the big and the small are both useful compositionally. You just have to, by being aware of them and by knowing them, you can apply them to your own work. Okay, we've talked about passing tones, chromatic passing tones. It's another variant. It's just used as a chromatic note. Okay. Suspension. So suspension keeps the same note from before and then steps downwards. And it's tied over from the previous note, which is called the preparation note. So what we have is, importantly, the note it's tied over from is consonant for the previous chord. That's why they call it the preparation note. It's consonant for the previous chord, and it's dissonant during the moment of the suspension. This is the suspension moment right here. So at this particular time, it really desperately wants to resolve now. This dissonance is suspended until it finally gets resolved. Okay? Preparation, as we were talking about earlier, it's basically you have to prepare the suspension moment with a note that's actually in the chord. I guess it would be in the previous chord. And that's a way of introducing it so that the dissonance has some sort of basis in existing. It's like, ooh, it existed, I just held it for too long, sort of thing, and I'm going to resolve it. But that's the traditional suspension approach, by having it prepared beforehand and tied. The preparation is tied to the suspension. But you can have a rearticulated suspension, which happened in the Mozart earlier, where instead of tying it, like this is basically, this F and B belong to this G dominant seventh chord, which I guess is, from a larger perspective over here, it belongs to this chord right here. However, it doesn't belong to the C major chord. Now, in a traditional suspension, this would be tied over. This would be preparing. This does serve to prepare the suspension, but it's not tied. So this is called a rearticulated suspension. You can kind of see the difference. Over here, this G belongs to the C major chord, but it doesn't belong to the F major chord. Right? Over here, the G, again, once again, belongs to the C major chord. It doesn't belong to the F major chord, but it's restruck, so instead of being tied. So it's a rearticulated suspension. Okay. Yeah, a lot of stuff. But it's all good. Let's see. We can discuss this stuff another time. Grace notes, all that stuff. Forms. Let's get to the nitty-gritty. Let's get into the music, Roman numeral analysis sort of thing. Are there any questions, by the way, about anything? If anyone's kind of glancing over the midterm, they'd like help in a specific area. So I guess what we can do then is just kind of go into secondary dominants a little bit more, because they are a little confusing. So okay. Okay. I'm just going to arbitrarily have some chords out for you, okay? And maybe you can, well, you can follow along if you'd like. I guess we'll do 5. Well, let me use Roman numerals. We're in the key of, let's see, why don't I do this? So I'm going to create some spots for us for different keys. Okay. So this first key, I guess, I'm going to put as G major. The second one I'm going to put as D major. The third one I'm going to put as A major. Fourth one I'm going to put as E major. The fifth one I'm going to put as B major. And I guess what I'm going to do to start out with is I'm going to do the following. I'm going to do this in both major and minor. Okay. So what we have essentially, what I want to say actually before I even get into this, is there was a confusing thing that I had with minor keys that I actually changed in the one note. So I just want you to be aware of this. So the thing I wanted to tell you is that basically when you have, basically if you take the triads of the natural minor scale and you combine them with the triads of the harmonic minor scale, you're going to have basically, you're going to have several triads, right? Most of them will have the same exact root, right? The 3 chord has the same root. It has a different quality, but it has the same root between the two scales. The 4 chord has the same root. It has the same quality. The 5 chord has the same root. It has a different quality. 6 chord has the same root. It has the same quality. The 7 chord has a different root, right? This one has a G sharp. This one has a G. So in a lot of theory, I guess in like the real world, you will often not see the 7 like differentiated. Like you can't actually know which scale you're in just by looking at the Roman numeral without its capitalization. But if you look at the capitalization of the Roman numeral, you can actually know that the 7 chord, the capital 7 chord, implies the natural minor scale. So you actually know that you're in the natural minor scale. You're basically building a chord on the 7th scale degree of the natural minor scale. Whereas if you see the 7 diminished, you're actually building the 7 chord on the 7th scale degree of the harmonic minor scale, right? So that's an important thing to recognize. I think, because before I think I did this, I think I put like flat 6, right? That's not actually the way you encounter this for the most part. So I just want you to be aware of this. You have to kind of infer which minor you're in based on the capitalization. So, right, it'll have a big difference in your overall result, right? Because you have to make sure you build the chord on the correct note of the scale. If you build, it's problematic if you build a major chord on this, off the 7th scale degree of the harmonic minor scale, right? You'd have a different chord that doesn't exist, right? So be careful in that regard. So you know which scale is implied based on capitalization. I wrote this down twice. Actually, I wrote this down over here as well. You know which scale is implied based on the capitalization. So here you have a 7, you have a 7, but there's a different root, right? I guess I'm going to let people kind of chime in here. Which scale does this 7 chord belong to?
Natural.
Natural minor, great. Which scale does this 7 diminished chord belong to?
Harmonic.
Exactly. Okay, great. So that's important. I know my previous homework had it differently, but I updated the OneNote so it's consistent now. Similarly, the actual midterm will be consistent in this regard as well. So for instance, you will see a 7 for the minor key. Don't be alarmed. I guess I'll ask you now. What minor is this 7 chord referring to?
Natural.
Natural minor. So make sure, I guess let's figure out what key we're in, right? What key are we in?
Flat.
B flat, exactly. B flat minor. What is the 7th scale degree of B flat natural minor?
A flat.
A flat. What is the 7th scale degree of B flat harmonic minor?
A natural.
Exactly, right? So be careful. You want to make sure that you construct this 7 chord. You want the root of the 7 chord to be on A flat, not A natural. Okay? It's a big thing to be aware of. Okay. Okay. Any questions about that? Or is that
For
clear?
all the secondary dominant chords, kind of have a flat 7 because they're dominant?
Yes, they will. Because if you actually take a look at, remember, the key areas that you can tonicize, they have only major and minor chords suggest key areas that are good candidates for tonicization. So that kind of excludes this lowercase 7 diminished chord. You know, there's no way to tonicize this key area anyway, right? So actually, the only the secondary dominant that will be available to you for the 7 is the only one that you'll be able to tonicize is the 7 chord from the natural minor scale, because it's major in quality. Yeah. So that's another kind of clue as to what you have to do. But I can very easily see someone just being kind of fast and loose and being like, oh yeah, this is the 7th scale degree, and you accidentally put you actually use the harmonic minor scale instead of the natural minor scale. So just be careful.
Like the how it says 5 with a 4/2 inversion, it's still kind of be a dominant 7, right?
Oh yeah. So it will. I mean, yeah. If it says 5 with 4/2, this is going to be an inversion of a dominant 7th chord. If it doesn't say anything, well, I guess all of these are all dominant 7ths. I didn't include any that didn't have it. But if I did something like this, so that would just be a triad, a major triad, with a dominant function, right? I guess a secondary dominant function. But the quality of this chord would be major. The quality of this chord would be a dominant 7th. Cool. Okay. So let's do some examples. I like these secondary dominant questions because they kind of encapsulate a lot of stuff. You have to know your key. You have to know your primary triads. You have to know your primary triads well enough to actually build a secondary dominant on top of them. So it's kind of a one-size-fits-all homework problem. But anyway, supposing we're in a minor key right here. What key are we in? Someone who knew, who's never said anything. What key? Did someone say B minor? Yes, sorry, I still have an ear infection. But B minor, absolutely. So we're in B minor, and what's great about this, well, I guess it's great. There's no other reason for me to call it great except that it's great. Okay, so what do we have here? So maybe let me give you something to tonicize. So to be careful here. Is this correct? Does this chord exist? I have to check. No, it doesn't. Sorry, let me check this really quickly. Does this chord exist? No, it doesn't. So I can't do this, right? I made a boo-boo. Sorry. Give me one sec. Now I'm worried. Did I make the same boo-boo over here? No, I didn't. I had good foresight here. I just didn't have good foresight here. Okay. Sorry. I'm doubting myself right now. Good. Okay. So what do we have here? We're in B minor. What is the 3 chord in B minor? What is the root of the 3 chord in B minor?
D.
D. Indeed. Okay, so we have D. Okay, so we have to build a triad basically off this, and it's going to be a major triad because that's the quality of the chord that exists in a minor key. Okay, there we go. In fact, let me restart this really quickly so you can actually hear the audio. Secondary dominant. Fun. Okay. Yes. It's going to be a D major chord. So I guess what would the root of the secondary dominant chord be if we're trying to tonicize that chord?
A.
It would be A, exactly. So what we have here is a D major chord. So the root of this chord will be A. Okay? There you have it. Okay? Let's try this one, except let's do major. What is the key signature? What is the key represented by this key signature?
F sharp minor.
F sharp minor or A major. So I guess let's do the F sharp minor version because we haven't done enough minor examples. Okay? So we're in F sharp minor, and let's do this one. Okay, so what is the 4 chord in F sharp minor? What is the root? Let's say the notes one at a time as a class.
E.
What's the next one?
E.
D. Oh, not that one. Sorry, my bad. What about now?
F sharp.
Very good. Okay, so we have a good old B minor chord here. Awesome. What is a 5th above B?
F.
Good. F sharp. Good. Okay, so by default, it made this a minor 7th chord. We have to actually change this A to be an A sharp. Not surprising, right? Because when you're dealing with secondary dominant chords, oftentimes the chords won't exist in the key that you're in. There is one exception to that, which is right here. It's funny that happened for the last one, because in some ways this 5/7 of 3 can also be considered the 7/7 chord, right? In other words, you can actually build, if you remember the 7th chords of the key, if you took this 7 chord and you just added another note to it and made this a 7th chord, you would basically get one of the primary 7th chords in the key. So that's like a weird example. This, incidentally, is the only chord, the only secondary dominant chord that doesn't have an accidental. But this one does. So I guess if you don't have accidentals for your secondary dominant chords, you should check that you have, you should check why, because chances are you should have accidentals, because remember, you're tonicizing a different key area, and as a result, you're going to run into accidentals that aren't in the original key. Okay.
So just to clarify, like secondary dominant chords will never be in the, not never, but they'll most likely never be like in the in the original key signature.
Yeah, they'll most likely never be in the original key signature. Like this is the only exception I can think of. Let's see. I guess this is the minor example. For the major example, there's one example in major too, kinda. But it goes away once you add the dominant 7th chord to it. I guess, okay, here's what I have to say about that. Yeah, I mean, the triad itself in this case, remember, like if a dominant 7th chord can be represented through an underlying triad, you get all of these triads, right? In this particular case, the 5 of 4 in major actually doesn't have any accidentals. But if you add the dominant 7th to it, there's an accidental. Let's take a look at these ones right here. It turns out that this underlying triad has an accidental, this underlying triad has an accidental, this underlying triad has an accidental, this underlying triad has an accidental. This underlying triad does not have an accidental. So you would run into the same sort of situation where it would appear as though if I just did this 5 of 6 instead of 5 7 of 6, there would be no accidental. But since I'm doing 5 7 of 6, there is an accidental. But I guess that's, to answer your question, generally, based on kind of the statistics of looking at all this, you will find that the secondary dominant chord has an accidental. Not always. I just showed you, like, basically the underlying triad. If I did give you 5 of 6, there would be no accidental. That's one case. If this one right here, 5 7 of 7, that's, sorry, 7 7 chord. That's also one that exists in the original key. I guess the idea is most of these chords won't exist in the original key, and I think that's what you were asking. But some of them will exist under certain conditions.
Yeah, there's something to notice here also, which is that the third of the secondary dominant is always going to be a half step below the tonic that it resolves to.
The third of the secondary dominant will always be a half step of the tonic it's resolving to. That's absolutely correct. That's a good observation. And I guess that's something that is worth talking about just in terms of dominance and secondary dominance. Basically, the third of a dominant or a secondary dominant chord will function as the leading tone of the key area that you're tonicizing. So if I just look at this B, for instance, it resolves to C, right? This C sharp resolves to D. This D sharp resolves to E. Yeah, that is a good pattern that you found. That's true. Cool. So, anyway, let's see how are we doing on time. Okay, let's take a look. Let's try something different. I'm going to go to my real book, a fake book, I guess. I think that's here. One sec, really quickly. So I got a fake book right here. So let's take a look at this song. And maybe we can actually analyze some of this stuff holistically. There's no Roman numeral analysis here. So we actually don't immediately know if something's a secondary dominant just by looking at the chord symbols. But I bet you can find one. So I'm going to scroll, and actually, I'm going to look at the index, okay? And someone say a song they like.
Back in the USA.
Back in the USA, okay. I think that's going to be quite bluesy. Got to update these page numbers so that they reflect correctly. You said the Banana Boat song, right? No, I'm just kidding. All right. Back in the USA. Okay. Yeah, this is absolutely a blues form. So actually, let's count the number of bars, okay? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. 12 bars. Interesting. Very, very interesting. Look at that. The 12-bar blues form. Now let's take a look at this piece really quickly, and let's add some Roman numerals, shall we? So basically, we have a 1 chord here. We're in the key of C major. We have a 4 chord on what bar? 1, 2, 3, 4. We have a 4 chord on bar 5. Huh. That's interesting, right? We have a 4 chord on bar 5. Very characteristic of blues, right? Okay, then we have, what do we have then? What do we have here? 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, so we have a 5 chord on bar 9. And a 4 chord on bar 10. And a 1 chord on bar 11. So bar 9, 5 chord. Bar 10, 4 chord most of the time, right? So this is absolutely a 12-bar blues form. No doubt about it. We're back in the blues, okay? So yeah, great stuff. I'm glad we got to talk about the blues form. There's no secondary dominance here. But there are a lot of interesting features of blues music in this piece. And I wonder if there's the blues scale as well. So what's interesting about this is check this out. You have this E flat right here, which goes against this. Okay, so check this out. So what you have is basically, sorry. Man, blues just woke me up. All right, so I was up really late making this midterm last night. All right, so what we have right here is we have this right here. We have C major chord. But what we have in addition to that is this E flat, right? Interesting. Would you call this, I guess you could call this a non-chord tone at that particular junction, or I guess if you think about the blues scale, what's interesting about the blues scale? Whoops. So check this out. What do we have here? From the blues scale, check that out. So right here, what a big characteristic of the major blues scale is this flat third note and this non-flat third note. So what you have basically, flat 3, 3. You can also kind of call this, some classical people, of course, like adding less cool sounding names to things. They call this a split third chord. I guess that's not so, I guess that's kind of a cool name. It just sounds so formal for such a cool concept. But yeah, I guess it's called a split third chord because you have the flat 3 and you have the regular 3. If you have a chord that has both of those things at the same time. Right? So blues music kind of does that. This is like a blue note. Right? So it uses the major blues scale, yippee. And then you also see a bunch of A right here. Da 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 da. In fact, I challenge you to find in the first 8 measures, I challenge you to find a note that isn't in the blues scale. In the C blues scale. There isn't one, right? It's exclusively using the C blues scale for the first 8 measures or so, right? Interesting. So this is a great technique. And even though you're changing chords, you're going from the 1 chord to the 5 chord, the idea here is that you can use the same blues scale and permeate over this progression. It just sounds nice. So for instance, like, you could like use chord tones for every single one of these points in time. You could be like, I'm just going to exclusively use notes that exist in the C major triad this time. I'm going to exclusively use notes for my melody that exist in the F major chord at this time. I'm going to exclusively use notes that exist in this G dominant 7 chord at this time. Or you can just be like, I'm just going to play the C blues scale over all of these chords, and it's going to sound just fine. And that's what a lot of composers do.
It's the B flat from the G major blues scale.
The B flat is from the G major blues scale, exactly. So then what you're doing here is this right here is from the G major blues scale. So it's basically you're doing like, and then when you get to the G major chord, you're basically referencing the G blues scale, absolutely. And then you're going back to the C blues scale. Many composers wouldn't even do that. You know, this is actually being a little bit more local in scope. It's basically saying I'm gonna actually play a scale that fits in with this G chord very tightly. But if you want to be fast and loose, you can actually, there's many songs that just use the C blues scale for the entire song. Right? You can see how that could just sound just as fine, right? But in this particular case, you took a more local approach and said, I'm going to use a G blues scale right here, as evidenced by this B flat. Okay, let's see. In 2 minutes, let's scroll through another piece really quickly. Someone pick a song, any song.
Can we do a Bee Gees song?
Somewhere Over the Rainbow.
I think I heard someone say something before Somewhere Over the Rainbow, but I couldn't hear because my ears are clogged. What did you say?
I said, could we do a Bee Gees song? Is this the fake book with the Bee Gees songs in it?
Let's see. The Bee Gees. I think so. I just don't know. What's it? Staying Alive, maybe? Is that a Bee Gees song?
Or More Than a Woman? Is that one? Yeah, More Than a Woman. That one's a good one.
More Than a Woman. Huh.
I think they have it.
I don't think they have
They
it.
probably have Staying Alive. That's like a classic.
Well, I think it's almost time. But what we can do is next class we can do More Than a Woman. I bet you. Let's just quickly see if it's on Hook Theory. For some reason, they like hide this. The coolest part of their thing. It's hard to access. But let's see. More Than a Woman. Okay, so this one has chords. Okay, well, I'll look into this song for next time. That's cool. I don't know if I know this song, but this will be a good one to look through next time. All right, guys. Well, I think that's it for today. A lot of review, I know, but if you have any questions, I can stick around and help you with whatever you'd like. It's a lot of information. Normally, in this situation, I'd actually have you do problems. Sorry, excuse me. I'd actually have you do problems, and you would basically be able to prompt you to do these things, but it's a little harder to do this in a telematic environment. So the result is, yeah, hope you were able to follow along, and I'll put these on YouTube so you can kind of watch these later if you'd like to. And yeah, please subscribe. Actually, if you're wondering when my newest video releases are for this class, just subscribe. It works out for the both of us because I get more subscribers, and you get to know when I release the videos. So everyone subscribe to my YouTube channel. Hit that like button and subscribe. All right. Sorry, I'm trying to sound like a regular YouTuber now. Yeah, I'd greatly appreciate it if you did.
Sorry, I have a question.
Sure.
So what kind of 2-5-1 like chord progression would you need to like be able to use the C blues scale?
A 2-5-1 progression that you could use for the C. I guess for those of you who are wondering, the 2-5-1 progression is basically this. It's basically 2 chord, going to a 5 chord, going to a 1 chord. It's the Sound of Music, Climb Every Mountain song. That's a 2-5-1 progression. It's very common in jazz. So I think your question was, what kind of blues scale, what kind of chord progression, 2-5-1 progression works with blues scales?
Yeah, or it doesn't have to be a 2-5-1, but I just know that's like pretty standard for most like ones. So
that's a good question. I haven't actually necessarily connected those two ideas in that way. I think the way I think about it is that the blues scale can kind of, it's like the first scale that a lot of jazz people learn because you can kind of play over anything with it. So a lot of like beginners and experts will use the blues scale. Beginners will just be like, they'll just throw the blues scale on everything because they don't know how to wield it. And they're like, well, this like somehow kind of works anywhere I go. So like, it kind of works there, right? I can't think of a song where it wouldn't work. Let's see. Well, there's probably definitely a song that doesn't work. So like, I'll try. Well, that's why like so many great jazz artists, they always throw in the blues in unexpected times. And like Oscar Peterson, for instance, he'll just. I think the idea behind the blues is, it's more about establishing, using the blues scale to really emphasize the underlying key area that the chord progression is kind of navigating through. So in other words, if you have a 2-5-1 chord progression, it would be wise to choose a blues scale over the 1 chord, not over the 2 chord or the 5 chord. I think it would sound better if you just did, right? If you did like, oh, sorry. Whoops. Oh, this is a disaster. Yeah, so essentially, if you remember what I said about like the more local approach versus the more like broad approach, you could like play it like you could do something like this, where you have, let me put this in eighth notes to show you what I mean. You could do whoops, sorry. Whoops, sorry. So for instance, what you have here is, oops. Right? So what you could do is 2, 7, 7, 1. Right, you could actually like play the D minor blues scale and then the G major blues scale and the C major blues scale. Or you could just another equally convincing way to do this would be the following. shortcut for this. There it is. You could just like use the C blues scale for everything. And you can get away with this because ultimately in this case, this is like more of the broad approach. Like this is more of the local approach. And this is more of the broad key approach. So like in this particular case, you're like, oh, I'm gonna create a blues scale on every single individual chord, right? I'm gonna do a D minor blues scale here, a G major blues scale here, a C major blues scale here. But I think like the really like finessed jazz pianists, they'll kind of figure out what key you're in, and they'll kind of figure out what cadence you're going to, and they'll play a blues scale over that kind of cadence, if that makes sense. Like over the key, like the broader overarching key.
Yeah, that makes sense. Because I don't know, with improvisation, I feel like sometimes it's hard just switching from key to key, you know, and doing a different scale, you know, unless you know the scale really well, you know, you're switching chords all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. So I know what you mean. So I have specific patterns that I know how to play over specific chord progressions. So for instance, I have like a billion licks and ideas that I know how to play over 2-5-1. Or like, right? I can go on. Right? I'm not really thinking about each chord. I'm thinking about like the progression itself. In fact, what I'll do is I'll like take this progression and I'll sequence it. That way I know how to practice this progression in all the different keys. Because you're right, it's hard to think in terms. It kind of rescues you if you have an idea that you can weave through a chord progression, because then you don't have to do so much thinking. You're not like, oh, I have this chord, then I have this chord. Instead, you're thinking, I have this chord progression.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, it's a very deep topic for sure. Everyone does it a different way. But yeah, I guess 2-5-1's one example of something that you could do this for. But of course, like there are many other chord progressions. Same thing. Like the more you know how to solo over these different chord progressions, the better off you are. And it's only and then I guess practicing it and sequencing it in different keys is really great, because then you know how to do it, and you just know how it sounds irregardless of the key that you're in, which is cool. Yeah, you've been doing some improvisation lately.
Yeah, I'm really trying to do a lot of like jazz guitar improv, but you know, I'm just starting learning the guitar, and I you know, like, cause I'll put on these tracks, you know, that have these like